Delighted to be joined this afternoon by Professor Gary Hamel from the London Business School. Gary is one of the leading management thinkers of our time, and his latest book, Humanocracy, is a manifesto essentially to kill bureaucracy, which he says is undermining innovation and crushing the spirit of people in business. Gary, you're very, very clear in the book. Excellent work, by the way. Very, very cogent argument. You clearly are of the belief that bureaucracy is stifling innovation and costing organizations literally trillions of dollars, you say here. You also believe that at another level that bureaucracy is crushing the human spirit and turning us into semi-programmable robots, I think you say in the book. All this is the case, and I don't think too many people would argue against that. Why do you believe bureaucracy is so enduring?
You know, it's a great question, Frank, because people have been hoping that we'll move beyond bureaucracy for decades. Peter Drucker, back in the late 1980s, I think it was 1988, he said that within 20 years, we would have half the number of levels and a third the number of managers. And it simply hasn't turned out that way. When we look around the world, what we see in pretty much every economy is the number of people in the kind of managerial class has been growing at least twice as fast as all other categories of employment. So I think one of the reasons it's persistent, Frank, is because it does work. It works at what it set out to do. It set out to essentially make human beings as reliable as machines. Writing in 1911, Frederick Taylor, published the Principles of Scientific Management, and the goal was to turn these obstreperous, free-thinking, strong-willed human beings into reliable factors of production, and we kind of succeeded at doing that. So, despite me kind of arguing that it's time for us to move on to something better, the reality is that bureaucracy is probably the single greatest human invention of all kind, because all of the scientific inventions, the automobile, the electric motor, the telephone, and everything that followed, those would have never reached us as consumers if we didn't have this technology that allowed us to bring people together to do things at scale, in perfectly a repeatable way. So part of the reason it's persistent is because it works, although less and less well. And we're now at that tipping point, kind of like we are with the combustion engine, where we're saying, well, yes, it worked very well, but it comes with a cost that increasingly, our environment can't afford. I think that's where we are with bureaucracy as well. I think the other reason it's been very persistent is that because, bureaucracy has worked well for some people. If you've spent your life in a government department or an organization, you've learned kind of to play that bureaucratic game, how to defend your turf and hoard resources and deflect blame and manage up. It's worked pretty well for you. If you look over the last several decades, as the managerial class, their incomes have done pretty well. Ordinary workers, not so much. And so it both works after fashion. And although I don't think I know anybody who would claim to be a defender of bureaucracy, there are quite a few people who, learned how to play that game well and are not necessarily anxious for it to change.
Mm-hmm. You say in the book that many people believe that large companies are genetically incapable of changing. I think you understand that very, very well, but you're a little bit more hopeful, aren't you, that something could be done about it? This is why you have the manifesto for change. So tell us what makes you hopeful.
Well, I think, management experts have for a long, long time, as you well know, Frank, they basically argue that large companies are incapable of really being innovative. And of course, when you look at the evidence, that would seem to be the case, right? You don't even have to be a large organization. If you have a couple of hundred people, it's often difficult to move fast enough to intercept the new trends. And yet I think we make a mistake in the sense that I think it's right to say the large bureaucratic organizations aren't very good at innovation, but you can't say that large organizations overall. The dilemma is that virtually all of us have grown up in and around organizations that fit that old template. So it's logical for us, when we see every large organization built in the same way and struggling with innovation, it's easy to make that generalization. But here's some counter cases. I devote a chapter in the book to Haier, the Chinese appliance maker. They own Candy in Europe, GE Appliances in America, the global leader. So my first experience, Frank, with Hire was more than a decade ago. Their CEO and chairman, Zhang Rumin, read the last book I'd written called The Future of Management. He came to my office in California, and I laid out this vision then about building an organization that was more like a network than a hierarchy. And Zhang said, Gary, has anybody done it? I said, I don't think so. And he said, well, we're going to do it. I said, why? What's your motivation? And he said this, I'll never forget it. He said, our goal is to let every employee become their own CEO, to make every employee an entrepreneur, because we believe people are an end and not a means to an end. And so what they did subsequently, they divided this big organization, more than 60,000 people in China. They divided it into 4,000 micro enterprises. So you can imagine each has 15 or 20 people. Each has its own P&L. It runs as a little standalone business. Each is guaranteed 3 freedoms: the freedom to set their own strategy, to design their own roles and organization, and then to distribute the rewards of their success. All of these thousands of micro enterprises are tied together through internal contracting. So if I'm a little business making, let's say, 3-door refrigerators, I contract with other little micro enterprises for design help, HR help, and so on. But critically, those are freely entered contracts. There's not layers. It's a company that has only 2 layers between those frontline teams and the CEO. And most interestingly, Frank, when they made this shift, they redeployed 12,000 middle managers. Those jobs went away and they will never come back. Now, most of those people still work for Hire, but now they're entrepreneurs too. They're working in these small little micro enterprises. And so when I look at a company like that spawns incredible innovation, they have more than $2 billion of enterprise value that's been created over the last few years of them spawning new business internally. What is very clear is that we can light the flames of entrepreneurship in any organization, whatever size, but you can't do it if you have 4 or 5 or 6 layers. You can't do it if employees feel, if workers feel like they're employees and not, maybe we should use the word micropreneurs, but if they don't have that entrepreneurial. And so I don't think we ever believe that you could create this inside of large companies, but for sure you can.
Mm-hmm. So that's a classic example of a model, which is, I think, is very, very important. And you make this point in the book. The models are very important. We've got to have little kind of case studies and little examples that kind of show us what to do. And you have a number of them in the book. But the other thing, one of the other things that you've identified in terms of the building blocks is motivation, and another one is mindset. So how do we rally people to the cause of killing bureaucracy, and how do we move away from this industrial age thinking about how we run our organizations?
Well, as you say, I think there's several steps. I think motivation is the first step. We may not see the path clearly to an alternative, and there are models, and thankfully for that. But they had to invent those models, right? Somebody had to stand up first and say enough is enough, and there are a few organizations on this. For the rest of us, it starts with motivation, and I think that comes in 2 forms, Frank. First, I think we have to be honest about the cost of bureaucracy to our economies, to our societies, to our souls, even in a way. And most of those costs never show up on a P&L. So an organization might say, well, we have maybe too many layers, or our staff groups are, but what really never shows up is the more insidious costs of bureaucracy: the conservatism, the timidity, the poisonous politicking, the apathy of employees who feel they don't have the chance to grow and to learn. And so we built something called the Bureaucratic Mass Index. And if people go to humanocracy.com, click on tools, it's all free. But you can, we built a little instrument that allows you to start to build a baseline of what's the cost of bureaucracy inside your own organization. I think it's interesting that a decade or 2 ago, very few businesses, organizations reported on their environmental impact, and now most do in some way. And we think the same needs to be happening here. Given the cost of bureaucracy to innovate, we think that every leader, every CEO, and every organization should be responsible for reporting and lowering that BMI, Bureaucratic Mass Index number. So I think it starts, as always, a problem can lurk in the periphery, in our peripheral vision for a long time until somebody starts to dimensionalize it, right? And we started to pay attention to the cost of environmental degradation. And so we need to do that here. So that's one. I would also say, though, very, very importantly, as you mentioned, it's also a mindset change. You know, I think one of the most damaging two words in all of business is the little phrase human resources. Because in that old bureaucratic mindset, and I get it, you know, and I understand why that's our heritage, where we came from. But in that mindset, we looked at human beings as instruments. So an organization would hire people to deliver a service, produce a product, and make profits. But in that kind of thinking, the human being is the instrument, right? They literally, we call them human capital, human resources. And yet, obviously, if you feel like an instrument, you will never give your best, right? You know, if your wife looks at you as simply the guy who changes the light bulbs and makes sure the car is filled with gas, you're probably not. And the same way, if you look at your spouse, you know, so we're not at our best in that way. And so I think the companies that have made this jump, they really flip that around. And instead, they think, you know, people come and freely join an organization. And they do that because they understand that helps them do collectively what they could not do individually. It's a way of multiplying their impact in the world and, yes, earning a living. So I think that shift in mindset is pretty fundamental. If you see human beings primarily as factors of production and not as agents in themselves, then you're kind of, you know, completely stuck there. So I think the first is motivation, the second is mindset, the third is models, as we talked about a little bit. And there are some amazing models. You know, I think the dilemma has been that most of us grew up in that old model and we just haven't seen the alternatives. And so virtually every organization we go into, whether it's church, whether it's civic society, whether it's government, whether it's education, whether it's business, we see the same thing. Authority trickles down. Power is indexed by rank. You have powerful staff groups who set the rules and enforce compliance. Managers assign tasks and then assess performance. People compete for the scarce resource of promotion. You just assume this is the way it has to be. You know, one of the stories we tell in the book, it's one of the most amazing organizations I've seen. It's a Dutch company called Buurtzorg. They're the largest home health provider in the Netherlands. Frank, they have 16,000 nurses and caregivers. They're organized into small teams of 12. Each team is responsible for finding their own office space, finding clients, hiring their compatriots, building a business. All teams are some people sharing best practices, saying, here's the training we're doing. So you can access the collective wisdom of the entire organization instantly in that way. Every performance is visible in real time to everybody else. So there's no place for mediocrity to hide. And so they run this organization with 16,000 employees with about 50 on-demand coaches, 50 people working in IT, and 2 managers. So that's a span of control of 1 to 8,000. And I like your listeners, your viewers ask, how many of you would believe that you could run a sophisticated healthcare organization with 1 manager to 8,000 employees? And yet they beat every competitive benchmark in terms of patient satisfaction, efficiency with which they use the resources, staff turnover. And so, you know, sometimes you see something, Frank, you can't unsee. And, you know, when I look at these organizations like Hire and like Buurtzorg, you go like, oh my gosh, all right. You know, like we're just stuck. You know, it's a little bit like, I'll give you an example. The first time I had one of the very first iPhones, the day it came out, I flew to London from California. The next morning I had an interview with a journalist at the Financial Times, and I handed this phone across the table, and the guy started flipping at it, and he literally started giggling like he was 60 years old, right? Because it was just so intuitive and so cool. And you could, you know, like once that's in your head, then you can't go back. And so I think as you explore these new models and you see them, you just go like, okay, there's another way. So I think now the last thing, and let's come back and talk about it as you like, but the last thing is, even if you have a model, then the question is, how do you go from here to there? So the last M, if you like, we talked about motivation and mindsets and models. The last M is migration. Somehow we have to get from where we are to this very different place. When most of us we didn't start with this new DNA. We weren't invented this way, our organizations, and somehow now we have to make that jump.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There's a lot of talk about empowerment and ownership, but to some extent, sometimes these are said in a very kind of a general kind of a way. Do you think that one of the drivers of improvement in business and real empowerment actually comes down to actually sharing, literally sharing the reward structures within the business in terms of equity and profit? That it's not just we empower you, generally we love you, whatever. How important is that literal ownership?
Boy, it is absolutely vital. Let me share some data, but let me take a moment, Frank, to put this in a slightly bigger context.
Yeah.
Right now, certainly across the developed world, we're having a debate on the future of capitalism. And there was an Edelman survey done this year, 28 countries, tens and tens of thousands of respondents. 56% of the respondents said capitalism as currently constituted does more harm than good. That's an extraordinary sense that capitalism does, the alternative is not very clear. Certainly there are a lot of young people, and I understand their frustration. There are a lot of young people who seem ready to give socialism another chance. But there's this, and in my country, in the United States, another recent survey, only 29% of Americans said capitalism is working for the ordinary citizen. And so, when you unpack that, there are a lot of very legitimate concerns people have. We have concerns about whether companies are too powerful, have too much impact on politics, whether they're taking care of the environment, whether they're alert to social goals. There are a lot of good reasons to care about this. But I have to say, I think sometimes this indictment of capitalism, mistakes capitalism as an idea with its implementation. And it's kind of like, blaming sex for overpopulation and teenage pregnancies and STDs. Right? You can kind of solve those problems without demanding we all become celibate. So I think when you really look at the heart of the complaint that people have about capitalism, it's that it doesn't seem that the rewards of our success are being shared very fairly. Mm-hmm. And that's a true statement. If you look at most economies, I would imagine it's true in Ireland, it's true in Britain, it's true in the United States. Over the last few years, most of the new jobs that have been created are not very good jobs. They're not high-paying jobs. And economists talk about low-skilled jobs. And I think that also betrays a mindset, Frank. And I think it's kind of if I can say it, it's kind of a BS kind of term. Because I don't think any job by nature is low-skilled. Right? But there are a lot of jobs that are low opportunity, where the people in those jobs do not have the incentives, the training, and the upside to learn and add more value. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you see people as, quotes, low skilled, if you judge them on their credentials, if you put them in a job where there is no autonomy, is no financial upside, where their ideas aren't heard, and then of course, you kind of tie their hands, intellectually speaking, right? And then there's no creativity forthcoming. It's very easy to say, well, we told you, they're kind of, they're a bit of a lunkhead, right? They're not going to do much. And so I think, and that cuts off their opportunity to grow and to learn. So when you look at many of the vanguard companies we talk about in the book, they pay their frontline employees way over the odds, way better than average in their industry. Not because they're unusually generous, but because they've created a management model that turns on the initiative and the ingenuity of those people. And there's a bunch of academic research that's exceedingly clear on this. More than 100 studies have looked at this, and they virtually all come to the same conclusion. That if you want to turn employees into inspired problem solvers, two things are necessary. One, they need autonomy. They need freedom to make real business decisions, to make their work better. And given that, Frank, it's unconscionable. It's unconscionable that only 1 out of 5 employees believes their opinion matters at work. Like, think about that. 1 out of 5 believes that. Like, why bother to speak up? There's only 1 in 10 who believes that they have the freedom to experiment with new methods, solutions, products, and so on. So without the autonomy, people just give up, right? Okay, fine. but you also need the financial upside. Because if you give people autonomy, but you don't give them the chance for financial upside, you're just kind of laying on more responsibility without any commensurate, rewards. Likewise, interestingly enough, if you give people more financial upside, but you don't give them autonomy, that also doesn't make a difference. Because I'm frustrated. Okay, I know that you'll reward me, but I don't have the chance to change the things that I know need to change to create a better business here. So I think, that it's that combination we see in all of these organizations. And what you see, whether it's a company like Nucor, a steel maker, whether it's an agricultural producer, in any of these companies, when you give people a real P&L, when you give them not bogus, synthetic KPIs, top-down targets, but when you give a small group of people a real P&L without too many allocations, when you give them control over the variables that will drive that P&L, when you give them a financial upside, get out of the way. The most profitable bank in Europe, it's mind-boggling, Craig. It's mind-boggling. Svenska Handelsbanken runs about 800 branches, about 12,000 employees based in Stockholm. They're across north of Europe. They're fast-growing bank. Okay. They have beaten their European peer groups every single year for 49 years. 49. Nobody comes even like close. They sailed through the financial crisis that brought, a lot of the Irish banks right to the brink. Never had a problem there. It is the most radicalized bank in the world. Every branch runs as its own business. If you make loans in that branch and the local branches make credit decisions, they price the loans, price deposits. Those loans stay on your balance sheet until they're mature. And so if the loans go bad, you take the hit as that local branch manager. So they've turned every little branch into a business with a P&L, with freedom, with upside. And so they've turned their entire workforce into entrepreneurs. So the recipe here is not that complicated. And I can tell you, any place we've seen this, you see companies that have twice the productivity of their peers, twice the profitability. It's just not hard to figure out how to do this, but yet very few companies have taken this step.
Mm-hmm. One of the things, Gus, that's happened in the last 6 months is that a lot of the certainties that were there in terms of the economy, in terms of organizations and practices, have been radically overhauled in the context of the COVID-19 situation. Are you hopeful that some of the dynamic that may have been released through the COVID and having to react to COVID could be channeled in some way to tackle the problem that you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm positive. I should say I'm cautiously optimistic, Frank.
Yeah.
What happens in a little crisis in an organization? Power tends to move to the center, and the officials, the bureaucrats come in and say, "Let's sort this out." But when you have a big crisis, power moves out to the periphery because the center is overwhelmed. One of the things we're seeing, again, we know it very well, but you've seen it. I'm sure you've seen it in your own way in Ireland. We've seen it in the UK, the US. Is that when you have a situation that is both novel, something that's happened that hasn't really happened before, and when it's fast moving. There's no way a traditional multi-level hierarchical organization can respond to that. Bureaucracy is a replication machine. It's designed to do a small number of things over and over again perfectly. The moment you introduce a lot of variety into it, just by the time those signals get processed and go up to the top, and of course, what we've seen with COVID is it presents so differently from region to region in the country, from town to town. It's not a uniform problem. So what happened with COVID, rightfully so, and we can put a lot of blame on our political leaders and so on. I tend to be a little bit gentle with them because, I'm not sure there's a perfect answer here on how to deal with this. There was so much that was new. But the positive thing that happened was nurses, doctors, local health organizations started to collaborate. They shared data. They were online together. They were looking around. What are they learning in Korea? What are they learning in Japan? How do we adjust? And so what we were creating was these a kind of ad hoc spontaneous learning networks where people were coming together to try. And then slowly, as we extract real lessons from that, well, then we can make intelligent policy. At the beginning, it was impossible to make intelligent policy. Here's the dilemma, though. So in a way, that's good, because a lot of people kind of dusted off their ingenuity and said, okay, like the center's not going to figure this thing out. We better start to figure it out ourselves. The dilemma, though, is that, and this we know from past crises, is that as the crisis wanes, power tends to go back to the center. And so the people who kind of lost power in the midst of the crisis, wait, no, we're still in control here. So it's very interesting. I'll just give you a little bit of data. So we've tracked in the US economy, we've tracked the growth of the bureaucratic class, managers, administrators, supervisors, and so on. After and that's been going like this for decades. After the 2008 financial crisis, there was a little dip. It came down. Companies maybe took out a layer or two, took out some managerial staff. But within a couple of years, it was back on exactly the same trend line. And I fear that will be the case here. You know, the one thing that COVID may not kill is bureaucracy. Maybe lethal in many other ways, but I'm not sure it's going to be lethal to bureaucracy. But I think it's going to give a nudge, because I think it's part of, and it's for sure the most demanding test ever, perhaps, of organizational resilience. But Frank, I think it's part of a broader trend that actually most leaders get. They're not blind to this. You know, they understand that we're living in a world where the future is less and less an extrapolation of the past. Mm. And, you know, and the challenge is not only COVID, you know, the challenge is climate change, is cybersecurity, it's mass economic migration, you know, it's declining birth rates, it's an aging population. You know, we're up against enormous number of challenges today in our world. And given those challenges, we cannot afford to waste the initiative and the imagination that bureaucracy so heedlessly squanders. And I think a lot of leaders get that. So I think COVID, as terrible and tragic as it is, I think it will give a little nudge. And you know, it's just one more example of, in a world of extraordinary change, we need organizations that are way more resilient and daring than the ones we have right now.
Right. You also say in the book, and then again, looking at the notion of tactics and what needs to change and how it might change, that the problem of rewriting the management code base needs to be disaggregated, you say, with small teams empowered to work on individual components. That's, you believe, the methodology that's going to move the needle here, essentially.
Yeah, for a variety of reasons, Frank, I'm very suspicious that some big top-down change effort can uninstall bureaucracy. Part of that is politically. You know, I meet a lot of very progressive CEOs and leaders who really do want their organizations to change. They're very frustrated because they do not have enough hours in the day to go one vice president at a time or one, you know, manager at a time and say, listen, you need to go from manager to mentor. You need to change the way you use your authority. And so, you know, they're stuck because in that old change model, even if you're the CEO, your power and influence is limited, and you are trying to change, you know, the next 10 people below you, and then the next 100. You know, it's interesting. You'll recall that when Pope Francis, you know, became pontiff, he quite bluntly said that he wanted to dismantle some of the Vatican bureaucracy. He was like trenchant on this point and scathing language. I think he called the Vatican bureaucracy the leprosy of the church. Right? That's a little stronger language than I don't use the word leprosy anywhere in the whole book. I can assure you that. Not even cancer. I just don't know. But somebody asked him, Frank, last year, how is it going? You know, this effort. And he said, I feel like I'm cleaning the Sphinx with a toothbrush. Right? This is somebody who, you know, the faithful believe is infallible. Yeah. Who has, you know, absolute authority, and yet he is powerless really to do this. Yeah. So I think that's one reason it's difficult. I think another reason that's difficult is if you look at the systems we have now, the bureaucratic systems, how we allocate resources, how we measure performance, how we set targets, how we develop our plans. All of those things are connected together, right? Those bureaucratic systems and structures are quite complex. They're all linked together, and trying to and of course those things develop over years and years and years, right? That's 100 years of growth of all these systems and structures and so on. Simply saying, I am going to blow all that up, and I'm going to reimagine that entire structure from the top we're going to architect it all out like we'd architect, you know, a new skyscraper, and then we're going to, nobody has, the problem is too complex. And by the way, there are some folks who've been exploring alternatives to bureaucracy, and they've gone in and they've tried to just like put one, you know, we're going to take the old system out, put the new, it doesn't work. You know, people resist it. You find out it doesn't work very well. So we believe that replacing bureaucracy is not something you do all at once. You don't just like blow up the old thing, but you start with a new set of principles, which perhaps we can come back to. But then it's about experimenting. You know, it's about saying, well, is there a way of doing performance reviews where instead of having managers review subordinates, maybe we could have peer reviews? Could we try that? So let's run that in parallel with the old model. Don't blow its there up. That has a purpose. Let's run it in parallel. Let's have a hypothesis. We think this is going to result in fair ratings, multi-point ratings, whatever. So have a hypothesis, test it in a small scale, quickly, cheaply, and see if it works. If it works, okay, now let's move to that model. Because when you go back, Frank, and you look at the organizations today, like Hire, for example, or like Birdsword, that have these amazing models, they built those things one little piece at a time, right? Let's try this performance measure. Let's try this way of setting targets. Let's try this way of choosing leaders. So those things are the product of evolution of a lot of little experiments they did. And so I think every organization will have to be on its own evolutionary pathway. Now you can be guided by some principles. You can look at those other exemplars and say, well, I don't have to figure this all out on my own. There's some things there that maybe are worth imitating. But I think it's going to be, you know, like the human body itself has developed. It's going to be through rapid experimentation. So I would say, you know, the challenge, one way to say this in a nutshell, the challenge for every organization is to evolve its management model faster than its competitors in ways that make the company more resilient, more innovative, and more inspiring. And the way that evolution is going to happen is you are just experimenting more often. You know, it's kind of what Jeff Bezos has said about Amazon. He said, I wanted to make Amazon the world's biggest laboratory. Now, he was talking about new products, new services, and so on. They're just going to try more things. But I think we have to take the same attitude when we think about reinventing management and our organizational model. We're just going to have to, the winners are to be the people who try more things. And so, you know, we, as a species, we've learned that if you want to do something that's both radical, but also without blowing things up, that's pragmatic, that's an experiment. You try it, you see what works. If it does, you propagate it. If it doesn't, you say, all right, let's try something else.
Gary, it's a very, very powerful and well-written manifesto. Humanocracy, creating organizations as amazing as the people inside them. And Gary Hamel, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Frank.